Okay, let's go ahead and get started today. We have just a little bit I wanted to finish up with respect to politics. One thing we didn't talk about on Tuesday, and then we'll move on into talking about culture and society during the later Middle Ages. I want to remind you that the next primary source essay is due tomorrow, so if you haven't completed that, make sure to complete that by tomorrow. The last element I wanted to talk about with respect to politics from last time for this period is the Reconquista. Essentially, this refers to the retaking of Spain by a variety of forces from Muslim control. In many respects, though, this is something that starts in the later Middle Ages, but it will actually take through the period that we're talking about, and it will be the 15th century before the full reconquest of Spain takes place. Now, the Islamic conquest of Spain, as we've talked before, has been halted in, the extent, that's the word I'm looking for, the extent of the conquest had been halted in the 8th century by Charles Martel, the grandfather of Charlemagne, in the Battle of Tours. Christians and Jews in Spain did have some religious freedoms. We've talked about how that was often the case in various places. But Islamic culture and religion did spread throughout Spain. Some Christians there adopted Arabic as their language, which also affected their liturgy, and still continues in some places today where Arabic influences certain types of the liturgy. When the Umayyads were conquered by the Abbasids, the Moors, as Spanish Muslims were called, they remained faithful to the Umayyads. And often the remnants of the Umayyad Caliphate made their way to Spain, or Al-Andalus, as it was known. So this was largely an attempt to reconquer Spain, to control the expansion of Islam on the western side, much like the Crusades ostensibly were on the eastern side. The kingdoms, the regions of Castile and Aragon joined forces to push the Muslims out. But just like what we saw with the Crusades, often fighting ended up occurring between Christian groups as much as it happened between Christians and Muslims. Now, the Islamic or Moorish impact on Spain is still seen in a lot of aspects of Spanish culture, and so it's never totally been gone. But by the end of the medieval period, we see a great expanse of Islam through what was originally Christian lands. And so the great keys or patriarchates, Jerusalem, Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, and Constantinople, by the end of the medieval period, only Rome is not under Islamic control. Good, Mitchell.
Is this reconquest of Spain period, is that the time where the hero known as Castile or Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, is that during his time or is that a later time?
I'm not sure. I don't know that much about El Cid, so I'm not sure where to place him.
It's really cool. You should learn more about it.
Yeah, okay. I'll look into that. And maybe I'll have an answer for you later. So it does kind of take us into the area that or the end of this course. But, an important aspect here, because it was seen not just as a political thing, which it obviously was, right, a reconquest, but it was also a religious effort as well. As much of what we saw since the 4th century has been, politics and religion have been so tied together that they are inseparable through this period. Let's turn now into talking about some of the, I forgot to put that part of the slide, the continued presence of Islamic elements. I want to make sure that we remember that will be an impact in Spain and Spanish culture even into the present. Let's move to talking about some of the aspects of culture and society. the intertwining of this with Christianity and how that was a large part of the Middle Ages as it has been. And thinking about it, Christians at various times have made efforts, some positive, some negative, in trying to understand their society, respond to their society. And one of the elements that I think where this is reflected in a negative way is what happens with the office of the Pope throughout this latter Middle Ages period. Whatever we may think of whether or not the Pope was an office that Jesus intended, personally I don't believe that God ever intended for there to be an official like the Pope. But in all fairness to Catholicism, it would seem that this type of leader should be someone that reflected the character of Christ to the greatest extent, right? So if the leader of the church, he should be the one that looks the most like Christ. And I think in many respects, a lot of people who have had a say in that in recent years have tried to find somebody that would reflect Christ. That's not always been the case. And throughout the Middle Ages, as we've already kind of seen, the efforts to try and control the papacy by the rulers, emperors and kings, haven't always been about who is going to be the best example of Christianity as much as it's been about who can I control and who's going to make decisions that are favorable to me. And unfortunately, the later Middle Ages period that we're talking about often saw what we might consider to be an extreme level of immorality in the papacy. And so a variety of people tried to control who was going to be Pope, and how the papacy was going to impact culture. There was often a lack of control in Rome, and individuals ascended to the papacy in horrible ways. Additionally, there were other aspects of the papacy that also reflected this struggle for power. A set of documents known as the false decretals, or sometimes the pseudo-Isidorian decretals, after the supposed author Isidore Mercator, were attempts by religious officials to control the power of the Pope. Now, Charlemagne, of course, had tried to bring order in his realm. And it's not just order in politics he's interested in, he's wanting order in the church as well. Which meant that not only during Charlemagne's reign, but in other types, bishops of churches, abbots of monasteries were serving the king or the emperor as much as they saw themselves serving the church. And of course, as we talked about on Tuesday, the practice of lay investiture, where a noble could appoint a bishop, also tied these leaders to rulers, these religious leaders to rulers and nobles. Now, Charlemagne largely saw this as, it's his task to use the state's power to get the world to submit to the church, which led to a confusion, of course, between what's political and what's religious when it comes to power. Additionally, there was the development of a level of authority known as the archbishops. Now, the term archbishop had been used previously to refer to special representatives of the Pope, but during this period, it becomes a term that is used to refer to bishops of important places, important cities, sometimes also referred to as metropolitan bishops. And they were considered to have a higher level of authority than a regular bishop. But there is then the concern that the archbishops now have too much power. And that seems to be the case. The power is given, but then that power increases, and so now there's an attempt to control that power. So popes decided that what needed to take place was we increase the power of the bishops to offset the power of the archbishops to maintain our power as the leadership of the church. So these documents, these false decretals, false decrees, were produced to try and balance the power and bring order back to the church. Now, the documents were supposedly, they were written as if they were from very early bishops and very early leaders and early church councils from the 4th, 5th century in a way to kind of suggest, oh, it used to be this way, so now we need to go back to that. The documents themselves were probably forged somewhere in the 9th century, but by the 11th century, they really become important in this struggle between Pope, Emperor, bishops, and archbishops. And as I suggested, those documents tended to present the current conditions in the 11th century, or the 9th century, and onward as being in contradiction with the practices of the previous centuries. So this enabled, as people bought into this, it enabled the popes to shift the power over the bishops from the emperor to the pope. Eventually, though, the documents decreased in influence because the bishops continued to become more independent throughout the Middle Ages, which kind of was the unintended consequence of all this. The Pope is trying to do this to kind of sustain his authority, but it actually ends up with the bishops having more authority. It's not until the late Middle Ages and the early Reformation period that the documents are finally discovered to be and shown to be as forgeries. Additionally, in all of this, there is that continued struggle between East and West that is going on. And in the context of all this, there is quite evidently a moral decay and a variety of other struggles that occur in the papacy. Popes were murdered. There were quick successions of popes over short periods of time. Pope John VIII, for example, reigned from 872 to 882, 10-year reign, but that was before he was murdered. There were 3 popes in the next 9 years after that, which leads to unrest, not just in Rome, but all over. Popes were strangled, they were starved, thrown in prison. There were often rival claimants, right? Multiple people claiming to be pope. There's the case of Pope Formosus, who was elected in 864. He had been a cardinal and an emissary of the emperor who rose to the papacy through scheming. He retains a group of bodyguards, and there are rumors that start to circulate that any of the enemies of the Pope disappeared. Again, not very Christ-like example here. After he died, a couple other popes ascended to the throne. Several years later, his body was exhumed, right, taken out of his grave. The vestments of the papacy were put on it. He was set in his throne, and his body was put on trial. And this is what's known as the Cadaveric Council. And so they gathered to pass sentence on this cadaver. He's accused of and condemned of all sorts of crimes. 3 of his fingers are taken off of his hand. The teaching authority of the Pope was often represented with a kind of a 3 fingers up, circle with your thumb and index finger. And so those 3 fingers that represented the teaching office were broken off of, again, this is a corpse, and then his body was dragged throughout Rome and thrown in the Tiber River. Shortly after that, there was an earthquake that some people took as a sign that what had happened to Pope Formosus was against God's will, and so a mob rises against that current Pope, Pope Stephen. A later pope would take Pope Formosus' body and reinter it back in his original grave in St. Peter's Basilica. Down the line, such trials were banned. This was not something to be done. But that didn't end it. Later popes went back and forth as to whether the decisions of Pope Formosus were valid, whether the bishops he ordained were valid bishops, etc. There is a legend that a later pope did the same kind of trial with his body again and beheaded it this time. Right? And so for a while, this guy was like public enemy number 1 after his death. After the mob rises against Stephen, there are 6 popes in the next 2 years. From the years 896 to 904, there were 10 different popes. 7 of them died violent deaths. In the 10th century, 2 prominent women from a noble family, a woman named Theodora and a woman named Marozia, appear to have been very influential in shaping the papacy. Theodora was the wife of a senator. Marozia was her daughter. Marozia becomes the concubine of Pope Sergius III when she is at the age of 15. She would go on and take other lovers and husbands as well, but it is rumored that they'd have a son. After Pope Sergius, Theodora has her lover John made pope. He becomes John X. There's some question as to whether he was actually her lover or not. He also had a close working relationship with Theodora's husband. Later on, Marozia, remember her daughter, will have John X deposed and perhaps even murdered. She will arrange for the next pope, Leo VI, who will rule for 7 months. And then the pope after him was also someone supported by Marozia. When Pope Stephen VII dies, her son, from the relationship of Sergius, becomes John XI at the age of 20. There's a really interesting family tree you can find on Wikipedia, right, of all of this and how it takes place. Eventually, Marozia's son, Alberic II, will throw her into prison, ending her power but asserting his. 4 later popes throughout the first half of the 11th century were descendants of Marozia in some form or another. One of them is a man named Octavian, who is the son of Alberic II, who becomes pope and takes the papal name John XII.